This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture. And welcome to the City of God podcast, where we are weekly talking about today's biggest cultural issues, all through the lens of God's infallible word. I'm Rabe Pacienza, joined by my co-host, John Rabe. And John, today we have a very special guest, a guest that's been on the podcast before, and that is Dr. Tim Sansbury.
One of the smartest guys that I know. I mean, most people are, I'm used to people being
smarter. You say
that
about every guest.
Yeah, I'm used to that, people being smarter than I am, but he's smarter than everybody. And so that's, I'm embarrassing him here, I think, or he's really pleased with it. But either way, really smart guy. We're going to have a great discussion today.
Yeah, so Dr. Tim Sansbury is a professor of philosophy and theology at Knox Theological Seminary, in addition to being the provost of the seminary. So Dr. Tim Sansbury, welcome back to the City of God.
Great to be here. Great to be with you both, and happy to be able to join you this morning. It should be a lot of fun.
So let's dive right into the topic, which is incredibly complicated, the topic of postmodernism. Can you, for our audience, kind of explain what postmodernism is and give our audience a helpful definition?
Yeah, I think we were talking a little bit before the podcast started. The definition is slippery, and people, make jokes about how hard it is to define postmodernism. So maybe just for the sake of discussion today, you can split it into two kinds of things. There's one way that people talk about postmodernism, and what they meant, this is when I was in seminary, everybody's talking about postmodernism. What they meant was a relativistic culture, a relativistic world, where basically everybody's picking their own truth. Now, the real postmodernism the relativism came out of this failure of Western culture. There was this optimism in the Enlightenment, in the modern period, that we're going to figure it all out. We're going to learn what's really true. Humanity is smart enough and strong enough that we're going to solve all the problems, figure out real truth, and we're going to make the world perfect.
The end of history. We've come to that point.
Right. And you get that even in World War I, the nickname, the war to end all wars. One last time, our old humanity is going to come out, and then it'll be over. And, that lasted a real long time, the spread from 1 to 2. But this kind of optimism, we're going to figure it all out. And so postmodernism, there's really two forms. Like there's this intellectual side that was the philosopher saying, yeah, forget it. We're never going to figure it out. We've got no access to real truth. We've got no way to know. And so believe whatever you want, because you're just as likely to be right as anybody else, because we've got no access to truth. That's kind of the sort of philosophical relativism was more of this sort of depressed, resigned, I guess we'll never figure it out. But it translates, culture translates those things differently. You can't really live that way. People don't live that way. So in the relativistic culture, you had people being very affirmative. There's absolutely no absolute truth. There's absolutely no absolute truth. And it's like, you can't hear that. And that was always fun in my classes. I could always get one of my freshmen to do that when I was teaching freshman philosophy and, really use that word absolutely. But, there's absolutely not one way to God. Okay, well, then you're making an absolute truth claim. There's really a lot of that kind of nonsensical postmodernism, which was in the regular culture, but that's the relativism side of it. More broadly, if we were to say, I think if you were to talk about postmodernism as the modern period was, we're all really smart, we're all really awesome, we've got these vestiges of our old ugly life, but we're gonna produce a utopia. We're gonna figure it all out. We're gonna make a perfect world. War is gonna end. We're all gonna be happy. We're all gonna be joyful all the time. We're gonna do it ourselves. That optimism is still dead. I mean, you've got this fractured society that we have now that I would say isn't relativistic anymore, but it still is pessimistic on humanity as a whole figuring it all out.
It's a really interesting sort of conglomeration. And if someone is tuning in, they could think, well, this sounds very sort of esoteric and philosophical. But the point of all this, these are the currents that exist in our culture. This is why the people that you work with, your kids, your grandkids, your friends, these currents are why they think the way that they do. And so as Christians, it's important for us to understand where people are coming from and where they've gotten off track. But we talked so much about postmodernism for a couple of decades, and it really was, we could see it in front of us. Oh, words have no meaning, and this overarching narrative doesn't apply anymore. So it's just my truth and your truth, that relativism that you talked about. But it has been in some ways superseded now by this weird conglomeration that says, well, words like male and female don't have any actual meaning. But if you use the wrong word in referring to someone in that regard, you will lose your job, you will lose your livelihood, you will lose your social status, you will lose. And so we're absolutists on certain things. How did this happen? How did we go from postmodernism into this sort of post-postmodernism and so quickly?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the relativism, and it is esoteric at one level, but you can see it in all these different areas. You can see it in art, the breakdown of meaning in art. And so you have the move towards something like Impressionism, where you've just got, you're getting away from realism, and then you're getting into this abstract art. You see the breakdown all over culture, but you see these ideas that maybe start off esoteric translating out into the culture, and usually not very thoughtfully, because culture is not very thoughtful. And so the relativism's happened a bunch of times before. There's been relativistic periods, but they're always short-lived, because it just doesn't work for everybody to pick whatever they want. Society can't function that way. And so if we were to think just about relativism, the old relativism ethic was believe whatever you want, just be nice about it.
Right.
And people aren't nice. And so really, if you were to think of what we're doing now is we're believing whatever we want and we're just not being nice about it, you've kind of captured the big picture of the change. But I would say, and I don't know what it'll finally be called, and I don't know what the name is, but the relativism is this idea you pick whatever you want, but just hold it nicely. Understand it's not really true. What I see today is people moving into a new thing, which the two features that I call it uncritical fundamentalism when I'm talking to my students about it. And what I mean by that, or anti-critical fundamentalism, excuse me, that we are grabbing onto belief truths, like we're grabbing onto these ideas, we're holding them firmly, and we're actually avoiding any kind of criticism. We're avoiding any thoughtfulness. We're avoiding anybody that might, you go on the internet and you find people that are experts that agree with you. You find people that are idiots that disagree with you. You kind of shop, you share with this private culture that you can build online. And all you do is look to reinforce your beliefs.
And the algorithm can keep you in that silo as long as you want. Yeah.
So it's anti-critical. Like for me, I'm trying to tell my students, hey, listen, if you've got a viewpoint, you want to read more people that disagree with you, and you want to read people that disagree with you well, so that you can strengthen your viewpoint in terms of how well you can defend it. But if you don't want to defend your viewpoint, if you just want to hold it more strongly, then look for people that sound good, that agree with you already, and look for people that sound terrible, that disagree with you, and then bang, just feel better and better and better about what you believe. And you're further and further divided from people that disagree with you. And that's the second piece, this fundamentalism. What I'm trying to capture for that when I talk about that is that we treat everything like a religious belief. I mean, it's really fascinating how everything becomes something to divide over. And I use this example, and it gets me in trouble sometimes, and it gets me. I think it still works.
Here we go.
Example, yeah. But when you think about COVID and masking, we ought to be curious about whether masks work. That's what we should have been.
Sure.
Do these work? And how well do they work? And how well will people really comply? There should have been curiosity. And then if we disagreed, because look, the data wasn't going to come in for a while. To me, it's like it's a mask. I wouldn't divide. I wouldn't stop being friends with somebody, but we had people changing churches because just whether or not a piece of cloth over your face actually was helpful for COVID became a reason to change communities that you've been embedded in, where you were theologically on board, you were on board with the worship, you were on board, these were your friends, these were your colleagues, but you got to go someplace else because of a disagreement about whether or not masks work. And that's really fascinating. And you see that all over the place, where we can't have a disagreement on ideas, because if you think about ideas differently, you're actually on a different team. And that, again, so you talked about words not carrying meaning. And I think this is another way the culture has embraced that postmodernism, where words don't carry meaning, but then shifted it. And words often aren't carrying meaning, but they're like banners. You used to go to war, and you would carry, have somebody that was the banner waver.
Which is sort of what the mask was too, yeah.
Absolutely. So words, words declare what team you're on. And so very quick sentences, maybe we want to talk about, maybe we could actually have a discussion about, they're not carrying meaning to open a discussion. They're declaring what team you're on. And so once your team is declared, again, everything's we're not going to have an argument. We're anti-critical. And we're fun. Like everything's treated like religious belief. Everything's worth dividing over. So you declare your team, and then boom, now we're just yelling. We're not having a discussion anymore. We're just yelling, or we're accusing. Like. We're doing these gross accusations, like, "Oh, well, then you must believe, and you must believe, and you must believe." It's like, hey, I just wanted to have a conversation here. What's going on?
Yeah. All throughout history, anytime the culture has critiqued Christianity, there's been clearly negative results, but there's also been positive for those churches and Christians and movements that were willing to engage in conversation, like you're talking about now, and willing to disagree, but to do so in a civil manner. Those churches and those denominations and those individuals have come out stronger on the other side. Is there a positive side to postmodernism in the sense of how has it challenged the church, particularly in the West, to think about how they clarify truth, how they clarify their arguments, and how they clarify their positions on key doctrines?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I started, my head was going someplace a little bit different. So let me start there, and then I'll try to come back to what you said at the end. Because, if you think about the modern period, this was, we're all going to figure it out. Like, we've got to have this rational process. And so, listen, I'll believe in a resurrection as soon as you can rationally prove a resurrection occurred. Now, the church actually has got, you can find some N.T. Wright's, some of his work, some of Hauerwas's work on proving or showing that historically we ought to believe in the resurrection. Some of that work is outstanding.
Yes.
But that came way later. In the middle of the modern period, you had the church getting challenged on this rationality and giving up on core truths to try to fit in. And postmodernism really kind of opened that up. If you went online and said you believe in the resurrection, that's just not that scandalous anymore. So, but there's now it's ethics that's scandalous. It's a different kind of challenge today. But I think the postmodern period, what it probably did more is challenge us to get away from this idea that we can get one monolithic way of stating everything, this sort of global humanity, global way. And it made us start paying attention to context and contextualization. And not all of that is wrong. There's some kinds of contextualization that's heresy. You're just giving away the truth. But there's other kinds of contextualization that are just obvious. Like that's what the Reformation, we're trying to translate into other, the native languages. Like that was beautiful. But recognizing it's not just word for word, but it's also ideas and it's thoughts. And, part of what you're doing when you're in the pulpit on Sunday is trying to bring what the Bible says and translate it to an audience that'll be able to hear it. And so I think postmodernism did a lot of good for us in terms of teaching us to contextualize the truth, teaching us to recognize that just because you have the truth doesn't mean you're going to win. Yeah. The idea of modernism was you get the best argument and you win the battle. And there are plenty of people that had the best argument that lost the battle because they were such jerks about it or whatever. However they presented it. But that's part of what, postmodernism was doing. So I think I don't even know that I would say it's about the way it made us clarify our doctrine, but it's the way it made us see there being more than doctrine and see that we need to translate our doctrine into ways that people can understand and hear where they are instead of where they ought to be.
Fascinating.
It's also always helpful for us to see what's cultural and recognize that culture is spectacles, and it's not exactly the same, and it's not the same as having the truth. But I'm curious, as we talk about, I really appreciate your analysis of where we are in the culture right now and how sort of aspects of postmodernism have faded and be replaced by this sort of tribalism that where it really is, it makes sense of so much. We're wearing team banners essentially and going to war over things that are symbolic over which team you're on. It seems to me that one of the things that's been added to that mix that really heightens it as well is that it's not just you're on this team and I'm on this team. We play kickball in school. You're on this team, I'm on that team. We can still go be friends afterwards. But everything now is elevated to the level of an existential threat. So it's not only that you and I disagree, but our disagreement presents a clear and present danger to my very limb and life. Jonathan Haidt has written about this recently, but there's this fragility that exists, especially as generations get younger, where everything is catastrophized. So, this is not just we disagree. This is you're trying to erase me. You're trying to destroy me. You're trying to kill me by disagreeing with me. How do we get to that point, and how do we as Christians get past that disagreement is violence?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know that I have a great answer yet for. I mean, it is clearly the case. I mentioned this anti-critical part. Mm-hmm. There is a kind of fragility to it, but it seems to be more than just, well, I don't have a good answer to that, so I don't want to have the argument. Yeah. It is like this personal attack. This like it's gonna kill me if we have this. It's gonna kill me if I'm wrong, and I don't know for sure where that fragility comes from, but to kind of apply the gospel, I think there is this. We are still made in the image of God, and we still are broken, and we still are aware that we need salvation. And I think the root, without being too over spiritualizing this, I think the root really is people are desperate for salvation, and right now what the culture is telling you is think your way into it. You can just refigure it. If you're hurting. If you're hurting about what we would have said in the past, you're hurting about your sin, don't change your behavior so that you stop sinning. Change your whole worldview so that it isn't sin. And so rather than feeling like what I need is a savior, and the savior is somebody who's going to forgive me for those sins and kind of help me to grow, be sanctified, and then ultimately redeem me. I need the world to be like the whole universe needs to be changed around me so that I'm okay.
Exactly.
I know I'm not okay. The world's telling me I'm not okay. The universe is telling me, like I'm telling me I'm not okay. And so let me just and so everybody builds a personalized worldview that makes them okay. And like all the old ways to solve it and to save ourselves, it doesn't work. And so there is this fragility. Like, what if that isn't the world that I'm in? Like, what if my little micro community isn't actually the right one, and that produces this angst. But that angst is the opportunity for the gospel. But it's going to be hard, I think, to figure out how to communicate it, because so often when we present the gospel, it's again that banner thing. The first thing we're saying to people is, you don't belong here. I've got nothing for you. You got to change to be like me, and then I can tell you about the truth. And I think it's going to be a real challenge to figure out, how do we let people get past that first level when everybody is freaking out on the first level?
Tim, you've committed yourself to the work of seminary and raising up and equipping ministry leaders to go out and contend for the truth. In light of this conversation and the challenges that we're facing in the 21st century, how has that changed or informed your approach in the classroom? I mean, the approach to the classroom looks drastically different than it did even 20, 30 years ago. So how does the battles that we're facing and the challenges that we're facing really drive you and inform the way you teach and the way you present to your students?
Yeah, so the quickest piece is I've got a lot of folks that come in and relativism was always going to be contrary to the church, because it was saying there is no truth. And Jesus says, I am the truth, like, period. Like, there is one truth and I'm it. And so that was never going to work. But this anti-critical fundamentalism, a lot of aspects of this feels like what we're supposed to do, like holding firm to the truth, recognizing that we may not always be able to justify it all the way, and really treating everything like we're supposed to do that sometimes. We're just not supposed to do that all the time. And so trying to produce a cultural environment within my classroom that says, hey, think about this, argue about this. Don't just tell me, don't just reinforce your own beliefs. Look at alternative viewpoints, look at them thoughtfully, represent them well. I mean, that's a big piece. I tell students, listen, I'd rather that you left disagreeing with me thoughtfully than agreeing with me thoughtlessly. Now, I want them to agree with me, because I wouldn't be saying it if I didn't think it was true, sure. But I want to build that process of thinking. But I think more broadly, in terms of the kind of like, how am I teaching the culture? So in the modern period, you're really the goal, an apologetic goal, I would say apologetics more than evangelism, was have the best argument. Yeah. Because it was about arguments. Mm-hmm. And when I was in seminary, people were talking about arguments don't matter anymore. Somebody might listen to you and go, man, that's an awesome argument. And you say, okay, so you want to become a believer? Like, no.
Good for
but
you.
I had a good argument. Like, yeah, oh yeah, it's better than mine. Let's see it, man. But they talked about relational apologetics, needing to get to know. And it wasn't you weren't getting away from the truth, but you need to have a relationship with people. And I think one of the things that I've tried to say based on this culture is, I think one of the most shocking things we can do to people today is to give their ideas a soft landing. And what I mean by that is, don't immediately come back at them. I don't care if they say something ridiculous, and I don't care if it's contrary. Of course, it's contrary to the gospel. If they're outside, that's what the Bible teaches us, is that everybody is going to see, if they're outside of the kingdom, they're going to see the gospel as foolishness, and they're going to have ridiculous ideas. So just listen. Give it a soft landing. Don't attack. Don't come back, and be surprising to people because you're willing to listen. Now, that doesn't mean that you accept their bad ideas, which is what a lot of people today in the church are doing. It doesn't mean that you don't talk about the truth. It means you don't start off with that fundamentalist antagonism over everything. If somebody wants to say something ridiculous to me about, whatever, during COVID, if somebody wanted to say something ridiculous to me about masks, well, okay, let me listen. And then I can I think just by the shock of listening, you're going to have times that you can get a door open that people aren't expecting. I don't think it'll work all the time. Like, I don't think relationships worked all the time 25 years ago. And I don't think the best argument worked all the time, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But I think it's a way to open the door, to show
that's so helpful.
Hey, listen, I can hear that, and I don't have to freak out because you disagree with me.
Yeah, we fight for the faith because we have to, not because we want to. We shouldn't always be looking for a fight.
Yeah, it doesn't.
And that's the problem. I see a lot of people inside the church that are just always looking for a fight. We contend for the faith because we have to, we're called to, but that we should not love fighting.
And I think so much of this is cultured for us by the internet, because it's so, like, I've had this experience before, where you're online, you're anonymous, but it's like kind of filtering out in the way we live every day. Yeah. Somebody says something stupid and you think of a great way to come back at them. Yep. And, it's like under your screen name, and you think of,
everybody's an expert too,
as they say.
Yeah. But then that kind of that becomes how people have learned to communicate. And so it's these really quick sound bites that are just meant to, like, destroy people. You're like trolling and destroying people online. All of that is becoming like the way we live. It's scary. And I think if we can fight that off and say, yeah, look, tell me something ridiculous and I'll listen. Yeah. And then I'm not going to live there. I'm not going to be convinced, but yeah, you can still hang out and let's talk. And then I'll tell you something ridiculous about Jesus coming back from the dead, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
And I'm no expert on anything, but looking at it myself, it just seems very obvious that social media has played an enormous role in this change that we've been talking about, from sort of a postmodern culture to this far more tribal, far more confrontational, far angrier culture that we have now, where everything is an existential threat. And so as you're describing it, Tim, it seems to me that, and this is just in my own experience, but I'm curious what you think of it, that, people are still people, and there are good ways to engage on this stuff and bad ways to engage on this stuff. And generally speaking, even in this crazy environment, engaging on the internet is not a good way to go at it. Engaging in an auditorium huddled around microphones is not the best way to go about it. But when you actually sit down with another person individually, it does change the dynamic quite a bit. It removes almost some of the hostility from the get-go if people actually just are in person with each other, a concept that we all sort of understood up until about 20 years ago.
Yeah, it is, because the togetherness on the internet, you're not joined by anything artificial, just by intent. I want people that are just like me. Then I'm going to go find people, or people that can't stand me. And so it's a very, sort of like oppositional type environment out there in terms of what community looks like online. And so I agree. I don't know what one of the things you can sort of say is, I lament the fact that community is going away so much. And I think in the church, we need to emphasize the need for community, and that online is not enough. But we also need to recognize that cultural changes, we can say, when technology changes culture historically, the people that are saying, don't let it happen, they always lose.
Yeah.
They always lose.
It does.
And so we really do need to also say, okay, community is good. Let's emphasize community, but we're not going to have it like we used to have it. So how do we figure this out? Like, how do we do it? And when we try to figure that out, some people are going to really mess it up. Like, I've got a friend that's involved a little bit in the metaverse. I haven't jumped in there at all, but there's apparently people starting churches in the metaverse. So you can go put your goggles on and you can go stand around in a church online. And That sounds so bizarre to me. But maybe that'll work. Maybe the gospel will get spread by some guy in VR goggles who's created a little, emoji of himself that's online preaching the gospel, and maybe people that wouldn't have heard it are going to hear it. Or maybe that's going to be one of those things that we laugh at 50 years from now. We're like, that was such an idiotic idea. I don't know. But we will need to try to find ways that say, okay, it shouldn't be that way. We should be meeting together, but the gospel needs to go out to people who aren't doing what they should. Yeah. And so we need to find ways to bring the gospel to people where there's not a double conversion. You don't have to become like us and then become one of us. That you become one of us, and then the like us really should be more of a global like Christ, right? But we become one of his people, and then you become more and more like him. And I think often as a church, we're looking for people to become like us first, and then they can hear the gospel afterwards. Not on purpose, but just accidentally by the way we talk and the way we live.
Tim, I want to circle back to the topic of truth that we addressed earlier. So in the 21st century, you hear the cultural lies, live your truth, just follow your heart, and just this open embrace of defining truth however you want. Why is it so important, whether you're a pastor, a seminary professor, or just a business leader in the community? If you are a Christian, why is it so important to have a biblically informed view of the truth, and what challenges should they expect in the world?
Yeah, so if I'm right that the way the world is trying to save themselves right now is by creating these worldviews that basically say, I'm actually already all right, and so let me just recreate the universe around me. Look, it's not going to work. We are made, the way the fall has impacted us, we have the image of God left in us enough to know that there's more than this, to know there is purpose, to know that we need salvation. But there's fallenness in every bit of us. Like every bit of us is broken. And so there will be no getting it on our own. There will be no getting to it on our own. We will not be able to be saved, to have comfort in we're not made for this life to be our long-term life. And so that's never going to work. And so in the church, I think first off, people need to hear there's a lot out there that sounds like truth about, how to become happy and how to become more well-balanced. And there is a lot of value to much of what people are doing in terms of self-help, if you recognize it in its place for this world and for specific issues that you may have. But when people are looking ultimately for peace and contentment and joy and happiness and purpose and meaning, that is not going to be found in any chicken soup book. That's only going to be found in the gospel. And the thing is way bigger than what they're looking for. And I think for Christians, we got to always recognize that one of the temptations throughout, especially in the Old Testament, it brings it out, but it's there in the New Testament too. One of the temptations is to believe the world and to capitulate to the world and to become like the world and to see the world's answers as the ones that really work. And 100 years ago, the church was trying to fix Christianity by getting rid of all the miracles, and then it would be like this updated, awesome Christianity that everybody would love. And I think today people are trying to fix Christianity by making it into one that doesn't tell anybody they're wrong. It doesn't tell anybody their sin. It doesn't tell anybody they're behaving wrong.
Reshaping ethics.
And just that reshaping of ethics is just as bad as reshaping truth. I mean, if 100 years ago people were ridiculous for believing the Bible was false but could teach you how to live, today they're ridiculous, and I see it in evangelicalism where people will say, I believe the Bible is true, but it doesn't tell me how to live.
Yeah.
Like, well, what are you talking about? Right. Like, but that's it's no more stupid than the old way. It's just a new version, because today the culture is calling us to capitulate on ethics, where broadly speaking, I would say 100 years ago, more of the pressure was to capitulate on truth.
Yeah. When we're looking at the people that we're trying to reach in this culture, it seems that as we look at all this unrest, we can also draw from it a little bit of a diagnosis of what it is that people are searching for. And I think you just mentioned a few of them, but what are some of those things that maybe we can deduce from the behavior that we see that people are looking for? Because, what is sin? Really, it's of course, it's running afoul of God's standards, but it always seems seems to be driven by, or often seems to be driven by, a good desire or a proper desire that then funneled into or fulfilled by illegitimate means. So if we dig under the illegitimacy of what's actually happening out there, what are some of the desires that are being demonstrated here that the gospel really does speak to, where we can try to connect with people?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like, one of my classes is ethics, and when we start talking about ethics, we start talking about idolatry. A lot of people just idolatry. Their first reaction, if they haven't thought about it much, is we don't do that anymore. Yeah. But if you reframe it, instead of thinking about an idol, whether it's a little one or
a little statue, yeah.
But if you start thinking about it in terms of what does God say only comes from Him, and where am I looking for that? And so then you can start to think, something like identity. What is my identity? What is my identity now on my own? And what is my identity in Christ? And when we're looking for our identity in something else, or, reframing, I am wonderful, and I just need to own that. The old Saturday Night Live, I'm good enough,
Stuart Smalley, yeah.
Enough. Yep, it's old Stuart. But that's become very enculturated in a way that it's less ridiculous than it was when I was a kid and watching Saturday Night Live at that point in time. But identity, hope for the future in this life, hope for the future ultimately, somebody to tell me that I'm okay, someplace to get love, like true love for who I am fully but redemption and guidance and all of these different things. When we start looking at what the gospel ultimately promises, and the real truth of who we are, the real truth of who we ought to be, and the real truth of how we can be that, and you're going to find any of those pieces, we know we need it. And you're going to find people looking for it in other ways. And that is idolatry, and that is going to be out there in the culture, and it's going to be a temptation within the church too, because God says we're saved, but it's going to be a hard life, that our ultimate hope is out there. And I lose sight of that every day. Every day I wish this day was a little bit better than it actually is. And wanting it now makes me often want to look, for me, I grew up here in South Florida. It's, if I just had a little more money, if I just had a little more freedom, if I just had a little more time, I'd be a little bit happier. And every time I've gotten a little bit more of any of those things in my life, I've been a little more unhappy. But it's still tomorrow. Tomorrow will be different.
It's the nature of us.
Yeah.
Tim, as provost and professor at Knox Theological Seminary, share with our audience, let me back up real quick. So this seminary founded by D. James Kennedy in I should know this as a board member and graduate of Knox, 1990 maybe.
Yeah.
The seminary looks drastically different in as far as its meeting the needs of students. Looks drastically different than how they were trying to meet the needs of students in 1990. The landscape of South Florida looks drastically different than it did in 1990. Why are you excited about what's happening at Knox and the opportunities that you have at the seminary to raise up leaders for such a time as this?
I think, and I had this conversation with somebody who was a little bit shocked at first. I actually think we are continuing the legacy of Kennedy in a way that would be surprising to most people. He leveraged technology in a way that was very unexpected to have the message from this church go around the world in ways that people weren't doing. It was one of the very first mega churches because of the leverage of technology. And what we're trying to say to the church is, hey, we're doing something similar. You've got people all over the world. The finances of coming to South, the finances of going anywhere have changed. The finances of uprooting and going to seminary have changed. But because of technology, one of the weaknesses of seminary in the past has changed too, and that is everybody picks up, they all go together in this kind of like private enclave for 3 years. You learn everything you need to know to go be a pastor, and then you go back and you're kind of arrogant and useless for 2 or 3 years until you relearn how to be useful in the church, how to be practical in the church, because you lived in a private world that isn't the real world. And what we're saying now is, hey, technology gives us the ability, you don't have to come here, like let us come there. So when I'm teaching a class, I've got students that are all over the country, sometimes all over the world, that are in the class with me. And we're saying your local church needs to get engaged. We're trying to tell all the churches. I mean, what we basically are saying globally, the technology we have now for education allows the church to take back ownership of training up leaders. The church can take back ownership of mentoring up its leaders. And so have your people that you see as being up and coming ministry leaders, keep them there, keep them where you have them, give them opportunities to serve. We'll bring the education to them, and the church can do better. It's not quite as much fun for me. I mean, in person is more fun for me as a professor than remote, But in terms of what it is for the church, I think it's better for the church because we're saying stay where you are, get educated there, and let your church raise you up in that context so you know how to serve there well. And maybe you never leave, as opposed to going off to seminary and then never coming back.
And as it turns out, you were sort of inadvertently or by God's providence well positioned for when the pandemic struck and set up to be able to continue and to everyone's benefit. This question could sound like or could lead to a good sales pitch, but it doesn't have to be that. I'm genuinely interested in the principles behind it. What is it that makes Knox, it doesn't have to be better, but distinctive from other seminaries? Somebody's thinking, I'm called, my church is telling me that I have some gifts, so I want to hone those gifts. But there are lots of seminaries out there. What is it that is distinctive about Knox Theological Seminary?
So I think if you listen well to other seminaries, because many places are doing online now, but if you listen to them well, you're still going to hear them saying, you ought to come here. Mm-hmm. The best way is here. But if you can't do it, we've got this sideshow, and you can get the degree from here, but it's not the real way. It's not the right way.
Yeah. And
what we're doing, I think the most fundamental thing, there's a lot of things that we do. I mean, our Reformed faith is distinctive. Our openness to people that aren't Reformed is there's ways you can talk about distinctives from different places. The classroom we've built out. But I think the most distinctive, as far as I can tell from really anyone, is no, this is the way that we are made for. Mm-hmm. Every Knox student is a Knox student. There's not the real Knox students and the remote Knox students. It's not, and it started off that way. It was Knox and it was Knox Online. But we said, 10 years ago, no, it's got to be one Knox. Everybody gets an equivalent educational experience. We're built for it. We're designed for it because it's good for the church, and we embrace it. And we're saying we're going to do online as well as we can possibly do it because we think it is the way that will be best for the church. If not necessarily for us all the time, it'll be best for the church long term to have people that are educated in their situation, in their location, with the education coming remotely. And I am not aware of anybody who's embracing it at that level and saying, you're not a secondhand student if you're an online student, you are just a student. That's who we are.
No, that's a good word. And the key phrase you said was for the church. Yeah. I can say as a board member at Knox, a lot of seminaries say they're for the church, but I can say that Knox is really for the church, that it's not about you walking away from your church and walking away from your ministry and just kind of ignoring that over here and putting it on the shelf. It's stay engaged in your church, stay engaged in your ministry, because at the end of the day, that's what seminary is for, right? To be for the church. We're equipping leaders for the church.
And people have written extensively about the dangers that theological students face when they go off to seminary, and keeping them
detach them from the church.
Exactly. Keeping them in their own church context is an enormous benefit, it seems to me.
Our audience can find out about Knox at
knoxseminary.edu. You can find out everything you need to know. It's all there online. We'd love to have you join us. You can take a class. You can audit a class. You can join us as a student.
Awesome. And let me put a plug in. By the time this episode is airing, we'll have Tim Sansbury's talk from Kingdom Come 2024 on the Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church YouTube website. So please check out his talk, and he's a regular in the pulpit as well. Preaches a couple times a year. I know you had a sermon coming up in the summer on Proverbs. So grateful for you, for your ministry, and thanks so much for coming on the City of God.
Thank you. It's been great to be here. I've enjoyed it, and love to come back sometime.
Yeah, well, let's do it soon. I always enjoy it.
All
Definitely.
Right, very good.
And that's a wrap for the City of God podcast. If you were encouraged or inspired by today's conversation, we pray that you would pass it along to a family member or a friend, anybody that wants to think more about this cultural moment all through the lens of God's infallible word. We pray that you join us next time right here on the City of God. The City of God podcast is produced by Coral Ridge Ministries and made in partnership with the Institute for Faith and Culture. Visit us at cityofgodpodcast.com to access all of our previous episodes. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or anywhere you get podcasts. A full video version of this podcast is available on YouTube. This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture.